but don't give the media and don't give school principals and don't give Conservative politicians any opportunity to try and stop the change that we all know needs to happen to get the result that I certainly want to see, because our policy actually talks about a drug-free lifestyle is the best. You make the choices, but what's important is that you know what you're doing before you do it, and for as long as cannabis is prohibited, people will not get access to the information they need, people will not be able to make an informed choice, and people will not actually be able to enjoy a quiet smoke in the privacy of their own home, knowing that it's actually far less harmful than getting sozzled on alcohol.
I'm the president of the Canterbury campus Cannabis Law Reform Group. We just started up because we recognise that there's absolutely nothing new in the debate on cannabis law reform, and there hasn't been for around 30 years. The people that put this thing together have been trying to tell everybody that cannabis is a relatively harmless drug and it's safe for people to use. It's a victimless crime. We believe that now is the time for us to push for this change, and now is the time when the consciousness of your average straight person is starting to get raised to the level where they recognise what the issues are and what our positions on them are. But the problem is that in a lot of cases our case is misrepresented. People seem to think we're wanting to advertise pot, we're wanting to distribute it to school children, and we're basically just wanting the complete decay of society as we know it. Now, one of the few things that everyone seems to agree on in this debate is they don't want kids smoking the stuff. In a society where psychoactives like alcohol are condoned for everyone above the age of 18, all we're really pushing for is the same rights to apply to cannabis use.
What we're really talking about is a much, much broader issue than the simple cannabis is just an aspect of it. What we're really talking about is our health, our well-being, our happiness. There's many, many issues, like when you take a risk, you learn. You never actually lose. If you never took any risks, you'd end up as a frightened little rabbit in a cage. And we don't want that, do we? No, too right. All right. Well, there's that. What's happening when people are in the right place, in the pecking order, everybody is happy. But when people are in authority, because they've got big pockets and they've got no wisdom, this is where we end up.
Thank you all for coming along, because if it wasn't for you guys coming along, we'd look pretty damn silly standing up here talking to ourselves, and we would we'd sort of feel that we weren't representing the interests of those people out there, because it's only really because of all your voices that our voice is indeed effective. Back on November the 5th, Kevin O'Connell and myself wound up a campaign where we committed the Misuse of Drugs Act, to trial, to public trial down in Cashel Mall. It was called the Guy Fawkes Day Judgment, and the defendant is the Misuse of Drugs Act. And we charge it with guilt and ridicule, because it's silence to speak for itself. This dangerous act, right, is an insidious blight on all citizens of New Zealand. It's not just about whether you get busted or not. It's about the sense of harm that you might come to because you have to put locks and latches on your doors. You're worried about security, because that's the kind of thing that this act makes. So we charged this act publicly. We declared that it creates lucrative, competitive and dangerous criminal black markets where there would be no crime. That it provides the criminal underworld with the incentive and currency with which to dominate our society. That it inappropriately legislates morality and subjects the rule of law into total and utter disrepute. That it maintains an absurdist double standard as against the legal and harmful drugs of tobacco and alcohol. That it turns off youth with the damned hypocrisy and creates a major impediment to effective anti-drug education. That it maximises the drug uptake on the basis that prohibition makes us want to use cannabis. that it sends a dangerous message that it's okay to abuse innocent people for non-existent offences. That this law creates an unlawful regime of arbitrary discrimination expressly forbidden under the Magna Carta, the founding principles of our democracy. It destroys honesty in Parliament and negates the concept of public representation. 52% of childbearing adults have smoked cannabis, and yet Rod Donald feels that it would be really useful to get one more person into Parliament. If we had true representation, right, 52% of Parliament would already be elected representatives and smokers. Well, I'd like to put a few of those elected representatives on notice. You've been found out, some of you. You've got histories of cannabis use. You've used it. You've gone on to succeed. I don't want you ruling on my life. It's an impediment to all our lives, this rule of law, and we've charged it. We declare it guilty. We say that it's a gross abuse of reason, it's a dereliction of truth, it's an unmitigated treachery against the public good. Is there anybody here who will lead my call for this act and call it treasonous, treacherous? I say it's guilty. It's guilty. It's guilty. It's guilty.
The globe at varying times, all these people will be on the march. One of the places that will be marching is a town in Canada called Victoria, named after Queen Victoria. In 1894 she held a commission of inquiry that was far-reaching. She studied the indigenous use of cannabis in India and in how it affected people, because people were travelling back to England and bringing this new herb back to England and using it for recreational and medicinal purposes, as did Queen Victoria. Her study was one of the best social studies of cannabis use in context and is still heralded as such. It was a landmark piece of work. 1894, she found that the harms were largely overstated, exactly as our own inquiry into cannabis and mental health held by the Health Select Committee. So, in a sense, we're here declaring this point here a prohibition-free zone in honour of Queen Victoria and what she stood for, as holding up to at least rule of ethos and ethics rather than a moral paradigm. Good on you, Queen Vic. In the tradition of good English sort of revelry, I ask you to charge whatever.
That should be legal. I'm real stoned right now. Anyway, $20 for a tinny is way too much. It's only like 1 gram in Christchurch, and it sucks. I reckon we should be able to grow it, and everyone's like me, and I know that. Not just me, eh?
The second one of these forums we've held, and I see familiar faces, so it's great that people have actually come back again. I've been asked by the media about 20 times today, why does ADA run this sort of forum, and do you do them often? And I said, no, we don't run them often, but we see it as an important role in the community. I think that this issue on cannabis is fast becoming a major issue on the political agenda of our ministers, and I think that we need to address this issue in an open, positive and informed manner.
My name is Jeanette Saxby, and I'm the South Island representative of the Aotearoa Legalise Cannabis Party. I am a teacher with a Bachelor of Education, Diploma of Teaching, and a parent of nearly 3 children. I divide my time between the West Coast, where I'm involved in political issues, and Christchurch, where I take this professional stance here. I'm here tonight to convince you of the reasons why we need to not decriminalise but legalise cannabis. It is only with a thorough understanding of the problem that we can solve the relationship cannabis has to society. The most reasonable approach is through informed education, and that is what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. The school principals, 300 who met earlier this year, reacted in a very knee-jerk fashion when they've said no to the politicians. I actually think we're on the same side. I think that we don't want to see drug use in under 18s. We don't condone the use of drugs. We feel that there isn't enough learning media resources put out by the Ministry of Health for schools, and I don't know if there's even a thorough policy that goes throughout New Zealand in dealing with cannabis offences in schools. What is currently in place is anti-drug propaganda. It's produced by various organisations who mean well. But while it's an illegal substance, people are not going to come clean. They're not going to talk about it. They're not going to admit they've got a problem. So therefore, we've actually got the door shut in our face before we can solve the problem. And as has already been mentioned, in Holland, where they have discussed this and they have got real with it, the use is minimal. I'm here tonight to convince you that the illegal status of cannabis must be changed to bring about honest and effective education and harm minimisation is what the government proposes. We are on the same side and we need to work together. There is a great deal of common ground that we can work with. We don't want cannabis in schools. We don't want the use, we don't promote the use of cannabis. And we don't want it available to those under 18. The Ministry of Health concluded in 1988 that the impact of cannabis on health is less than alcohol and tobacco. I'm here to speak about cannabis and education. I'm here to give you some facts about cannabis. And I seek the support of schools throughout New Zealand to educate and formulate policy that is both consistent throughout New Zealand and keeps our youth in schools rather than continue with suspension and expulsions. The statistics, last year 434 students were suspended for 46 days in drug-related incidents. Only 46 days in total. Now they were the lucky ones, because the ones that got expelled are probably going to be denied access to other schools. They're probably on the first step to sliding into more time on their hands, more time to do what? They've then lost their self-esteem, they can't go back to school, they've been denied an education. Goes on and on. I think that problematic cannabis use in schools is a symptom of other problems. I think that we need to give these children a break, not break both their legs and throw them out on the scrap heap. I propose that we go easy on first-time cannabis users in schools and play down the incident. but I do believe that continued offending will suggest or may suggest a problem. I think that we need to offer education, some counselling, parental involvement, and these things are all greatly effective in harm minimisation rather than the expulsion. An expelled student loses their right to an education, and I don't agree with that. I'm not a softie. I would take a hard line when it's called for, but you know, everybody gets a second chance. Look at Christine Rankin. A clear policy for all schools nationwide is what we need to have. We need to provide information that is factual and accurate. A lack of information was the greatest factor for teenage pregnancies, and our rate skyrocketed. Now, are we going to repeat that tradition of ignorance through the prohibition of cannabis? I'm a parent, and I don't want my 12-year-old smoking cannabis now or later. But at 18, she's old enough to enlist in the army, marry, vote, smoke, drink, and make up her own mind. And I think that the more information we can give our children, the more informed decisions they're likely to make.
The intrusion of the media in interpreting data is one of the reasons why we have a lot of ambiguity going on in New Zealand at the moment, and the way we have misreading and misunderstanding of the real nature of the danger of the drug. The fixation with human rights at the expense of the common good, and the failure to appreciate the consequences. Now, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we didn't appreciate the consequences of the smoking of tobacco. Sometimes consequences are very long-term indeed. And to sort of say that the consequences of smoking marijuana now are going to be minimal is to misunderstand the processes of consequences. Certainly, if we look at tobacco as an example, and there's no reason why we shouldn't do that. The desire for reform, I'm suggesting, is actually an exercise in adult selfishness, because the focus is on the rights to smoke marijuana at the expense of what it may do to children. The focus, you see, is very largely on my right to do something, have a free choice to do it. Now, in a responsible culture, that kind of thinking has been going on in our culture for a very long time. And the marijuana debate is just a consequence, or the process of the legalisation of marijuana is just a consequence of that particular kind of mindset, where we have become so preoccupied with our rights that we are no longer concerned with the whole idea of having to restrain ourselves for the sake of children. And that's just not in the context of marijuana, it's a number of other things as well. And I think it's useful to see it in that context. There are a number of issues relating to that I think that we need to hone in on as well. And these are errors in, I would call them errors in logic or errors in understanding. And these, and I've got 9, there are a lot more. Cannabis is no more harmful than tobacco. The drug crisis has been made worse by oppressive law enforcement. Holland's liberal drug policy, and I'll come back to that in a minute, has been more successful than elsewhere. Prohibition, that is harm prevention, does not and cannot work. Individuals should be free to smoke cannabis, not buy and sell it, of course, grow their own. Cannabis is a soft drug and therefore less dangerous. Harm minimisation does work, or harm reduction, I think was the word we're using now, it does work. Human rights are more important than the common good. Adult pleasure trumps child safety.
My reading of the literature is that in those countries that have decriminalised, there has not been evidence of significant increases in the number of people who have used or the number of problems with the use of cannabis, and I think that's a crucial issue. But I'll move on. I don't want to take that as an indication one way or the other about the whole argument of legalisation. I think thinking about this issue, there's been 3 main points that I really wanted to address, and that is, firstly, is cannabis harmful? If it is, how harmful is it, relatively speaking? Is it useful? The 4th issue, should it be legal, is not an issue I want to address here. We all have opinions. I want to really try and stick to the facts of literature. I'm also not a public health expert or a politician, so it's really beyond my expertise to argue that. A few key points that I think are worth making to start with. The politics of the debate, it's an emotive debate, leads to extreme positions, and I think the truth is somewhere in between. I think it's undeniable that cannabis is harmful, but it is harmful more to some than others, and it needs to be borne in mind who they are and what the implications of that is. I think all the evidence also indicates that cannabis is probably less harmful than both alcohol and nicotine, for a number of reasons, but that doesn't deny that it's harmful. It also has some clear uses medically. But then, of course, cannabis can be used by prescription medication, not just smoke. And so I don't think the medical issue necessarily indicates the need to legalise or decriminalise or deregulate. Another key point, I think a really crucial point to bear in mind, is that lack of evidence of the harms of cannabis does not mean it's safe. Right? While there might not be strong evidence that it causes harmful immunological problems, it doesn't mean it doesn't cause them. It just means the evidence is lacking. It doesn't mean it's safe. Okay. So I think there are subgroups of the population who are clearly harmed by cannabis. I think the evidence is fairly strong for some of those subgroups. The first one to mention is adolescents, younger people. I think there's clear evidence that cannabis is harmful, especially in terms of causing problems for short-term memory and attention, such that it can impact on education and may in fact also play a role in family dysfunction. But I wouldn't be so strong to say it causes family dysfunction. So I think adolescents, there's clearly incontrovertible evidence that cannabis is harmful for that group. Another group that I think there's good evidence of harmfulness of cannabis is those with serious mental illness, which, being a clinician as well, is a particular concern of mine, especially those people with psychosis and schizophrenia. And there's clear evidence that cannabis increases psychosis, it increases the rate of relapse for schizophrenia. Okay. Less clear evidence, but it's also likely that it increases relapse and elevated mood and bipolar disorder and manic depression. A number of other mental illnesses may be made worse by cannabis, some may be improved. But overall, I think cannabis clearly causes harm to the serious mental illness, and in fact, my opinion clinically, which I think is consistent with some of the evidence, is that it's one of the worst drugs available for people with serious mental illness. There's good evidence in terms of chronic respiratory illness that cannabis can exacerbate chronic airways disease. So for people with chronic airways disease, chronic asthma, cannabis can make that worse. The evidence regarding effects on the fetus, I think it's been accepted that there is good evidence that it can harm the fetus in terms of low birth weight, so that's questionable how much effect that in itself has in terms of long-term development. So this is recently questioned by studies that have looked at cannabis users alone versus cannabis and alcohol users. It may be that some of the effect on the fetus is attributable mainly to alcohol rather than cannabis, but it's not clear. Certainly we can't say it's safe, okay, for pregnant women. Cannabis clearly causes a dependence syndrome, an addiction, like alcoholism in a way, like drug addiction. But having said that, the number of heavy cannabis users who get severe dependence is probably quite low compared to the other drugs such as nicotine, alcohol, cannabis, and it can take quite a long time to develop. So some people clearly get addiction, but maybe fewer than some of the other drugs that are commonly used. It is harmful, but relatively speaking, maybe slightly less harmful than, say, for example, alcohol and nicotine in terms of its addictiveness. And there are clearly large numbers of people who used to use heavily some years ago and have now stopped without too many problems. Okay. That comment applies probably to adults. We're uncertain if that applies to adolescents. There's a worrying trend that one might see clinically of fairly rapid development of dependence in adolescents. And so I wouldn't apply that statement to younger people. I think we don't know enough about younger people to make a true statement about the effectiveness of cannabis in that group. The final group that's harmed by cannabis use, obviously, are those that get convictions. And so the other thing that needs to be borne in mind is the harms of cannabis use versus the harms and the consequences of using cannabis. So the impact of convictions I think it's important we're aware, as has been mentioned, of the impact that the message that gets across in terms of cannabis is illegal, it's not good, is borne in mind. One thing that concerns me equally is cannabis is dangerous and harmful and therefore illegal, so is heroin, and the lack of distinction between those two drugs. Because I'm concerned that some kids will think, well, cannabis is illegal and I've used and it's not so bad, and my parents have used and it's not so bad, so how bad is heroin? It worries me a little bit on that argument as well. Okay? I also worry about the lack of openness about cannabis. I think it is limited legally, and so I think there are harms from cannabis being illegal. But again, I don't want to make a statement about, should it be legal, should it not be legal. I think there's a whole lot of issues that need to be balanced. There are also possible harms from cannabis, but it's not all that clear. Childhood leukemia, there are some reports that maybe there's higher rates of childhood leukemia in offspring of people who use cannabis, but that's not clear. That is a concern that needs to be followed up on. The possibility that respiratory cancer might be more common, but again, it's by no means definite. There are immunological disturbances that you can pick up in laboratory animals and some people, but it's not clear whether those immunological disturbances are in fact damaging to health. They may not be. Clearly, cannabis probably causes memory impairment in adults, but it's not clear whether that's to a degree that impairs them. So there's a whole lot of questions about the harms of cannabis. And overall, the evidence for most adults would be that it's actually relatively safe compared to some of the other drugs that we've been talking about. So those are the key issues I wanted to make in my summary. I would just like to make one statement. It's more of a personal issue, standing outside my role as a senior lecturer at the MCTD. And that is my concern personally at what we mean by decriminalisation or legalisation. I would point to very clear evidence that private companies such as the liquor and alcohol and tobacco companies are very, very effective at promoting the use of these substances. I would have grave concerns personally that that would also apply to cannabis if private companies were to get involved in promoting it. And I would plead that we don't forget that. When we talk about legalisation or decriminalisation, we bear in mind that companies such as Rockman's, if they were to start pushing cannabis, and maybe so very effectively, and that if it were to be made less illegal, that if we let those companies involved promote the drug, then certainly its use is going to be more common. Certainly the harms from cannabis are likely to be much greater than they are now.
This education place seems to me a very good place to start. Where maybe that's where we can actually start building some bridges to one another. I don't think and don't believe in my heart of hearts there is a single answer, but I really do think there's a lot of reflection, a lot of prayer that really needs to go, because this does affect our country and our people, and we need to look after one another. And it's broader than just the issue too. I think there is a whole wellness and a wholeness issue. And from my own background, I think there's a big spiritual issue here too. We don't want to be wounded any more than we are, and I think the research is there, and there's been a lot of information gathered. So let's reflect on that, think about it, and talk to your MPs, and make sure that that reflected decision of where you'd like to see it go is communicated in a positive and proactive manner. We don't want to rip people down or kick their guts in. We want to be honest and mature people to say, I've got a point of view and I've thought about this and I'd like to communicate it in a positive way. That seem reasonable to you? So let's work together, and thank you very much for your attendance tonight.